Right. Well, this here is a picture of light being lensed, gravitationally lensed. So I couldn't find an English translation that wasn't under copyright still for Galileo's, what is it, 1632 work. So I did find this UC Riverside article with a quote, and a bunch of other people have the same quote from Galileo. Any two observers moving at constant speed and direction with respect to one another will obtain the same results for all mechanical experiments. But if Einstein realized, well, no, well, it wasn't even just Einstein. I mean, the idea was, hey, but we could defeat this principle by getting an absolute measure of our velocity relative to light, right? If we're going 100 miles an hour in one direction, we measure the speed of light as 100 miles less in that direction. And there's ways to do that, actually. So he's saying, no, you won't be able to tell the difference. And Einstein's like, well, okay, in the late 1800s, we have an experiment showing that our velocity relative to light is constant in any direction, in any reference frame. Then we'll have this distortion in time and space. And that, frankly, if I'd heard these stories at that time, I would guess Galileo's relativity is about to go down. But then they measured those differences, and whether it's because of a distortion in time or whether time breaks, they were accurate, drawn exactly from these ideas. And for most of us, that lends a lot of credence to the claim that there's velocity relativity. It puts the final nail in the coffin. UC Riverside's article, which is just an individual there, it's not like the university saying it, goes on to say this idea has a very important consequence. Velocity is not absolute. This means that velocity can only be measured in reference to some object. And that the result of this measurement changes if we decide to measure the velocity with respect to a different reference point. Right? So Galileo might not have thought about the light example, but he did say you will get the exact same results. There is no way to detect. And if you're on a spaceship with a broken clock, you ought to be able to detect that. So he's saying, no, you wouldn't be able to detect that. So I think that's pretty clear that he said what I claimed he said. The velocity is relative.
And he wasn't saying that, in my opinion.
And you're saying that if you're going half the speed of light, if you shine a flashlight in front of you, that light's going to move away at half the speed of light.
It can't move away, so that's the problem with what you're saying. If I'm going half the speed of light and I shine light, it can't possibly move away from me, okay, at the speed of light.
So say you, but me, Galileo, and Einstein say differently. And I'm not saying they have any authority. I'm just saying it's three random guys, obviously all geniuses, happen to disagree with you, also a genius. Just it happens. We have different guesses and understandings of the universe. That's fair. But then when somebody does an experiment that proves one of the ideas false, that would be your idea, and other ideas correct, that would be Galileo's idea, that we admit and accept that evidence, at least to the point that you need an alternate explanation. You can't just say, oh, it doesn't happen. No, that's impossible. Can't you tell? I found out in my gut brain. I found out in my gut brain that if I'm going half the speed of light, something nobody could ever test, but I know what would happen. And you say you know what would happen? You're arrogant.
Because I'm running half the speed it's traveling. So it can't possibly escape me, okay, where the first photon that went out of...
You don't understand the Michelson-Morley experiment, which you should. You should try to understand it, but you don't want to understand it, I know, but I'm just saying you should. I'm not saying I expect that you will do that.
That flashlight can't possibly escape me at the speed of light if I'm moving half the speed of light in the same direction. It's
because you say so, but that's what it does do, and that's what Einstein says. And no, we can't go half the speed of light. We have to test it at, a millionth of the speed of light. But luckily, it's the 21st century, and even in the 20th century, we had devices that could measure that kind of thing, and techniques. And the technique in the Michelson-Morley experiment relies on interference. You don't have to shift light very much before you start seeing interference patterns. And the exact pattern you see can even tell you the velocity.
It's a ludicrous proposition.
And that's not what happens. What Gary is really denying is that science can ever be anything that's not intuitive. All scientific results must be intuitive. And if you have an experiment that shows something else, then you should ignore those lying facts and listen to Gary's gut.
By cosmic rays and they're accelerated at high speeds and they decay slower. So there's a correlation between velocity.
Right, that's one example that you deny, and there's all...
Again, so he just claimed I just denied something I claimed to be true. I mean, you don't see how that's just lying about my position. I've never denied that muons decay slower. I've never denied the evidence that happens. I've explained it, not denied it.
Okay, it's hard to say what you accept and don't accept when you say so many crazy things. Like, for example, about the atomic clock. I was talking about the atomic clock, and you said, because things decay slower. But the atomic clock doesn't rely on decay. It relies on microwave emission, right? So you have like a laser feeding, pumping energy into an atom, and then the atom radiates light at a particular wavelength, and you can use that for timekeeping. It's not decay, it's a different process. So the muon is one example, this other is another process, and you just deny them. You say, oh, no, I'm not denying them because I admit that the decay is slower. You're denying the reason. You denied that there's any process besides decay. But see, you get to change your story, and you will, but it'll be a new kind of denial. You're not going to change it to an honest acceptance. You're going to create a new kind of denial. The other examples that triangulate on the reality that you also deny.
They triangulate on the reality. Well, that's an interesting statement. I mean, that's like why they fit on Bugs Bunny's head.
No, it means that we can't test 100% of every situation, right? If I say this is how velocity, this is how ballistics works. When you hit a baseball, it's going to take a parabola. I can't go out there and measure every parabola. I can only measure, 1,000 parabolas, particular ones. And if you, like in your style, you would say, yeah, but you never measured that one that day I saw, and it was clearly more of a circle segment. Well, you can only triangulate on reality by spot checking, figuring out what had to be true between those, which is the process of triangulating on one fact. Right? Triangulation means, hey, from here, it's in that direction. From over there, it was in this direction. I can now triangulate and find out where it is out there. Your understanding of words turns out to be very simple. I mean, this very odd. You react to words like triangulate. You react to ideas like time going past. We're supposed to listen to your fish. But if I say, hey, here's something I don't think that happens, but it's a good thought experiment about how under time's control we are, you stop at every 10 seconds talking about, time didn't go backwards, when that wasn't even the point. The point was, if time went backwards, we'd have no way to tell. And plus, we're talking about going back 400 years and you denying the Galilean reality.
The Galilean reality, again, based on what evidence? What evidence did Galileo have that there's no such thing as absolute velocity? He merely pointed out.
What evidence? I said this is what he believed. Evidence sometimes might have to wait for centuries, but we got 400 years of it, and so what evidence do we have that he was correct was a bigger question. He was making a theory. We built up the evidence since then. Now 400 years later, we have evidence. Now 100 years ago, we have Einstein with the final nail in the coffin. And Galileo said, any two observers moving at constant speed and direction with respect to one another will obtain the same results for all mechanical experiments. That can only be true if all the laws of physics change in their time, in the relative passage of time. Otherwise, you'd be able to tell from the differences. If the decay slowed down, but sugar metabolism didn't, then the human's clock, biological clock, would be running at the regular speed. we'd be able to detect that it was the object itself had slowed down. But it doesn't. And you're in denial of that. And you're also in denial of the fact that which spaceship is really going slower has no answer. They are both going slower from the other reference frame. And only if you accelerate one of the reference frames will you ever see one of them did go slower and one of them didn't. And if you track with general relativity what happens as that spaceship that's thrusting and accelerating to match the other spaceship, its time does all kinds of weird things during that period, so that it all works out such that at the moment that they meet and their rest frames are identical, the accelerated body will have the slower clock in the end.
Out on observation.
I'm not going to be
that
able to make
things
much more of
moving
this, I
at
can
velocity when they have no internal mechanism to detect acceleration, that they can't tell they're moving. Shit. So unless
Right. They can't tell they're moving, but if what happens with the speed of light that you say happens with the speed of light, if that's really happening, then they could tell. So Galileo's saying they couldn't tell, and you're saying, well, we could tell. We could measure our speed relative to the speed of light.
it's a bumpy road, if it's a smooth velocity, yes, there'd be nothing to indicate I was moving.
That all of Newton's stuff is based on. So you're basically rejecting all of science.
Okay, so now it's all of science, and this isn't even close to being.
Okay, just the last 400 years of science. As far as I know, you do not have a beef with Anaximander yet.
Even fundamental, even anything Newton would talk about. I mean, Newton wasn't a very bold or aggressive speculator. He gave you the formulas for gravity without giving you any explanation of why. And he pretty much said, I've told you what it does, why it does it. Who the hell knows?
Just modern science, you're rejecting all science as...
Okay, so again, this bold statement, I'm rejecting all of science because I don't first believe that Galileo claimed there was no absolute frame, and second...
Any two observers moving at constant speed and direction with respect to one another will obtain the same results for all mechanical experiments. I don't see the part about broken clocks in there. Unless a clock is broken.
that I don't believe it's all of science, that everything all of Newton's equations are based on time dilation, because they're not. The non-existence of an absolute...
See, here's where you're changing. We're talking about Galilean relativity. Time dilation is the thing that proves Galilean relativity is actually thoroughly true. To get such a weird result, to find out such a weird result would be necessary before the experiment is enough to doubt it. But after the experiment, it's enough to prove it. That's how that works.
Absolute frame. I don't think Newton ever even worried about that.
Okay. Newton didn't worry about time dilation, but his work is based on Galilean relativity. And the idea that in a vacuum, a thing would just keep going and going and going. That it's wind resistance that slows things down. It's gravity that makes things curve. Woo-woo modern. Even guys 400 years ago, you're saying they wanted there to be no center of the universe. And
I'm saying their description is perfectly accurate, so I'm saying exactly the opposite of what you're claiming I'm saying. I'm saying Galileo's observation was perfectly brilliant. The idea that you were...
Okay. So his observation is that any two observers moving at constant speed and direction with respect to one another will obtain the same results for all mechanical experiments. But you're saying that if a person is on a spaceship where the clock is slowed down, they'll get a different result. The wavelength of microwave light will be different, blah, blah, blah. It'll change it'll break that clock. That would mean that you could tell the difference. You do an experiment in one spaceship, you would get a different result in the other spaceship that's moving relative to the absolute grid of the universe. So that's why I'm saying you're disagreeing with Galileo. Now, imaginary Mandela, Galileo in a parallel universe that said something different from this? I don't know about that guy. Maybe you're talking about he's Galileo Galilei is not the only guy named Galileo. Maybe you're thinking of Fred Galileo, and he said something different. So you go show me that.
You shoot a cannonball. If you shoot it fast enough, it'll go all the way around the world. Yeah, I mean, perfectly rational.
They wanted relativity, so then they lied to us for 400 years about it. It's as insane as...
Again, my argument is that all you have as evidence is a correlation between velocity and a change in material function. That's it.
and slower radioactive decay. We had experiments with atomic clocks put in airplanes and driven around the Earth, and we had a little bit of decay change. So there's a correlation strictly between velocity and the rate of decay. What evidence am I denying in saying I can explain that with some other reason that it went into a time?
Well, there is the fact that atomic clocks don't rely.
certain amount of
Oh,
distance
fuck
and
this
open-
bullshit.
Well, again, I mean, if it's so glaring that I'm guilty of the same crimes as these people, why can't you possibly point out where I've committed a crime of equal duplicity?
I don't know where
you
we
can
are.
Just prove I was wrong. Why don't you just prove there's no electrons between the two slits? Why don't you just prove that?
I mean the thing that 3 days later.
That there's
I don't. Why? There's nothing in our theory that says there can't be electrons between the two slits.
no such thing as charge.
The rest of science was like, nah. That's how science works. There's enough freedom to try and claim and make reports and even get peer reviewed because you seem to follow all the rules and, of carefulness and.
Well, again, we know that that's not what takes place. So, this is just such a, I mean, I can only show it. I show how almost every example of the two-slit experiment I've ever been able to find, as documented on the internet, is incorrect. And I've pleaded for you to point me to the one that's done correctly. Show me the one that does the math correctly.
The thing is, YouTube videos aren't experiments. It's not the same thing. A YouTube video might be a report on an experiment, but an experiment is a careful description of the setup and then what you did and then the results.
And show me the one that does the images correctly. Go ahead, show it to me. All right? But until you can do that, I think I've demonstrated that your science is full of shit.
No, bullshit. You show it to me. I don't have to give up 400 years of science because you said so. You show me that the 400 years is wrong. But you can't even quote Galileo correctly. We're not even into science yet. You can't use Google enough to find out what Galileo said. And he said you wouldn't be able to see any differences. You're saying there is a difference. A photon clock won't even work if you're moving at a speed. And that's contradictory to what Galileo said. This is getting redundant, isn't it?
It doesn't get picked up. It's proved that nobody else can reproduce the cold fusion, so nope. And people are like, they hear a study came out.
Well, again, this really has nothing to do with this conversation. So you're the one who claims Galileo didn't believe in.
No, it does have to do with this conversation because you're claiming that they have successfully lied because of their pie-in-the-sky desires for 400 years about the relativity of velocity. And that they then lied when it would have to be that when Einstein figured out that means some weird things are going to happen with time and space, and they tested that, and in reality, they didn't confirm it, but they said they confirmed it because they just wanted to maintain relativity. They didn't care if it was true, if the universe behaved that way, which is an incredibly wacky conspiracy theory, right? People could get things wrong, but you have to say they lied about it. They couldn't have lied about it. Could they have been wrong? Oh, hell yeah. Science is always wrong, and in improving the things it's gotten wrong and getting them a little bit better, but they're still wrong and they could be made a little bit. That is science. It's not like the Vatican saying, hey, every year we record miracles, so God's got to be true. These are laboratory experiments, as if you could reproduce the miracle by setting up the same conditions. Right? Okay, yeah, this is getting tedious. And plus, I don't know, I guess I skipped some time because of the fucking thing.
Absolute velocity. I haven't seen any quotes where he didn't believe in absolute velocity. So go ahead and show that to me.
Okay, did that.
And it's like, oh, this is the new truth. No, that's not how it works. It takes 5-10 years before a legitimate new truth is actually confirmed. I mean,
absolute relative to a non-moving frame. So look, I mean, one of the things that gets a little complicated is suns. Okay, so you could say that a sun is sort of a good timepiece. Produces white light. That's what we see. And white light is kind of this even distribution of the red and the blue two extremes. And so without that even distribution, it's not going to be white anymore. And so then you have this idea of redshift. But I guess the real...
Okay, that's bullshit. Let's just do this. This should take a really long time. Spectrum of sun. And every star has a different spectrum. Is that what you mean by even?
Problem is the only time redshift really reveals itself is when you get up to pretty fast speeds. And so it gets hard to tell who's going 50,000 miles an hour, for example. A little bit hard to tell with just redshift. But I'm just saying you can sort of tell, though, that most of the universe isn't moving at spectacular speeds because it's not redshifted. The suns are producing white light. We're seeing white light, which indicates we certainly can't be moving at some obnoxious speed of light, some percentage of it, because then light we couldn't possibly see it without it being blue shifted.
When my grandmother was dying of Alzheimer's, I watched.
I don't see how in your system there is a blue shift, but then again, I don't understand the pair of tons hanging out pretending to be a photon either. That's what Hythloday says you mean, is that a photon is a pair of tons and they're hanging out together somehow.
Alzheimer's news really close, and believe me, they've cured Alzheimer's
Okay.
20 times.
Let me move
but
their head.
they can't.
This is where the
And
health
they've
system
did 100 times in
Wow.
rats, but
Yeah, fuck this shit, I agree. Bye.